We must say here that this particular service had been the object of his thoughts and aspirations for a long time. He had noticed that customs officials had many elegant foreign possessions. He was aware of the chinaware and materials they sent their godmothers, aunts, and sisters. Many times he had sighed and said to himself, "That's a spot to be moved to. It has everything. The frontier is close by. The people around seem quite refined. And there are wonderful shirts of fine Holland linen to be had." We must add that, in saying this, he had also in mind a certain French soap that imparted an extraordinary whiteness to the skin and a freshness to the cheeks. He couldn't remember the name for love or money, but according to his conjectures, it was to be found near the frontier. So, as we see, he'd had his eye on the customs service for a long time. But he'd been held back by the profits he was deriving from his current business with the building committee, and however tempting the customs seemed to him, it was like a stork in the sky compared with a sparrow in the hand. But now he felt he had to get into the customs service at any cost. And he succeeded. He started working with extraordinary zeal. He seemed to have been born to become a customs official. Such efficiency, perspicacity, and omniscience had never been seen or even heard of before. Within 3 or 4 weeks, he had become such an expert in the customs business that there was no aspect of it that was beyond him. He didn't need to weigh or measure to determine what quantity of goods he had to deal with. He could tell from the bill of lading how many yards of material there were in a roll. He could determine the weight of a parcel just by taking it in his hand. As to searching travelers, even his colleagues said he had the scent of a hound, and one could not help but admire the patience with which he would make people undo every button while remaining imperturbably cool and polite the whole time. And while those searched became raving mad, longing to belabor his pleasant countenance with their fists, his face and his courtesy remained unaltered, as he kept requesting, "Would you mind getting up for a moment?" Or, "Would you object very much, ma'am, to passing into the next room? The wife of one of our employees would like to have a little word with you." Sometimes he'd make a request such as, "Please allow me to dip into the lining of your overcoat with this little knife." And then he'd pull shawls and kerchiefs out from underneath just as coolly as though it were from his own suitcase. Even his superiors came to believe that he was a devil rather than a human being. He would find things in wheels, in shafts, in horses' ears, and in places into which no author would dream of penetrating. Places, in fact, which no one but a customs official is allowed to explore. The poor traveler who had just crossed the border needed several minutes to recover. And wiping away the sweat that had broken out in little beads all over his body, would just stand there, crossing himself and repeating, "Well, well," feeling very much like a schoolboy emerging from the principal's office after receiving a quite unexpected thrashing, when he had been called there to hear an admonition. For a while it looked as if he had all but run the smugglers out of business. The Polish Jews engaged in that trade were driven to despair. His honesty and incorruptibility were unassailable, almost unnatural. He didn't even take his share from the various confiscated goods. The items removed from travelers and not turned over to the treasury in order to save paperwork. Such disinterested zeal could not fail to become the subject of general amazement and be noted by his superiors. He was promoted and soon afterward put forward a plan which would net all smugglers. All he asked was the authorization to carry it out himself. He was immediately authorized to proceed and given unlimited power of search, which was what he needed. At that time, a well-organized, large-scale gang of smugglers had come into existence. He had been informed of its existence for quite some time and had even refused to talk to the representatives it sent out to try to buy him. "It's not yet the right time," he told them dryly. But when he received his new authority, he immediately sent word to the group, "The time has come." He had calculated correctly. He could now amass in 1 year more than a high official would get in 20 years of the most zealous service. Before, he'd not been interested in the smuggler's offers because then he was nothing but a simple cog in a machine, and therefore his would have been only a very modest share, while now it was very different, for he could dictate his own conditions. To make the business run smoothly, he let another official in on it, a colleague of his, who, despite his white hair, couldn't withstand the temptation. They came to an agreement, and business operations began. These operations were brilliant at first. The reader must surely have heard the story told and retold of the flock of merino sheep crossing the frontier in double fleeces, with millions of rubles worth of Flemish lace between the two fleeces. This happened while Chichikov was working for the customs. And had he not been interested in the operation himself, there's not a Jew in the world who could have pulled it off. After 3 or 4 such across-the-border grazings, Chichikov and his colleague were each in possession of around 400,000 rubles. They even said that Chichikov had passed the 500,000 mark, being the more active of the two. God knows what lofty figure they'd have attained from these transactions if the wind of discord hadn't blown between the two officials. To put it simply, they fell out and broke off. Once, in the course of a heated argument and perhaps under the influence of drink, Chichikov called the other official a clergyman's son. And although the man was in fact a clergyman's son, for some unknown reason he took great offense and answered with unusual violence. "You're lying. I'm not a clergyman's son. I'm a state councillor. But you're a clergyman's son yourself." And then he added, to offend Chichikov even more, "Yes, that's exactly what you are." Now, although he had roundly told Chichikov off, although he had returned in kind the name-calling Chichikov had initiated, and although he had made his point even more forcefully by adding, "Yes, that's exactly what you are," the other official was not satisfied. Albeit sealing his own doom, he dragged his colleague into perdition. They were both tried. All their belongings were seized and confiscated. It was as though lightning had struck over their heads. Only when they'd recovered somewhat from the stunning effect of the blow did they realize the mess they were in. Chichikov's former partner followed Russian custom and sought solace in the bottle, but Chichikov himself weathered the storm. He had managed to conceal some of his assets, despite the keen scent of the investigating authorities. He used all the tricks of his resourceful brain, which was so experienced and understood human beings so well. Using, according to the circumstances, affability, pathetic pleas, flattery, which never harms, and, on occasion, thrusting some cash into a hand, he managed to be dismissed a little less ignominiously than his colleague, and even managed to ward off criminal prosecution. But, of course, the bulk of his capital, as well as some graceful samples of foreign craftsmanship, could not be retained and passed into the hands of other amateurs. What he had salvaged were about 10,000 rubles, which he had stowed away just for such a rainy day, a couple of dozen fine Holland linen shirts, a light carriage of the kind used by bachelors, his 2 serfs, Petrushka and Cellophane, and also 5 or 6 cakes of the French soap, which the customs inspectors allowed him to keep out of humanitarian considerations, so that he could preserve his fresh complexion. And that was about all. So this was the situation in which our hero found himself after disaster had struck. And this was what he had had in mind when he said that in his career he had suffered for the truth. So one would have thought that after all these storms, vicissitudes, and disappointments, he would retire into some out-of-the-way corner, where he would spend most of his time sitting in a cotton dressing gown by the window of his little house, settling Sunday brawls between peasants, and for outdoor exercise walking over to the chicken coop once in a while in order to poke at the chickens and to pick one out personally for the soup. That he would thus spend the rest of his life quietly, but in a way not completely uselessly. But this isn't the way it happened. We must render justice to his resilience. The succession of blows, sufficient, if not to kill a man, at least to cool off his ambitions and appetites forever, hadn't succeeded in overcoming his amazing drive. He felt miserable, he swore at the world at large and at human injustice, and still he wouldn't refrain from trying again. In fact, he displayed a patience compared to which the wooden patience of a German, which is due to his slow and lazy blood circulation, is nothing. Chichikov's blood, on the other hand, circulated rather violently, and it took a great deal of willpower to keep under control a temperament that longed to break through all its restrictions and to go on a rampage. Chichikov reasoned, not without some foundation, along the following lines. Why did it have to be me? Why me rather than someone else? Who has taken over now? Everybody's filling his pockets. I've never made anyone unhappy. I didn't take from widows and orphans. I didn't turn anyone into the street. The things I appropriated were not indispensable possessions. They were luxury goods. And anyway, if it hadn't been me, someone else would have done it. So why are these others prospering now, while I must perish like a crushed worm? And what am I now? What am I good for? How can I look a respectable father of a family straight in the eye? How can I not feel guilty when I am burdening the earth for nothing? What will my future children say of me? I suppose they'll say their father was a selfish hog and left them nothing. We've already seen that Chichikov was very conscious of posterity. This is such a sensitive subject. Many a man would perhaps never have stuck his hand so deeply into some strange pocket if it hadn't been for this question that always comes up, for some unknown reason. What will the children say? And so the future founder of a dynasty, like a cautious tomcat squinting around to make sure that his master isn't watching, hurriedly grabs everything within reach, whether it's a piece of butter, a wax candle, a slice of bacon, or a canary. Anything he can get his claws into. Thus, while our hero was complaining and moaning, his brain remained active. It was fairly buzzing with schemes. All that was needed, indeed, was a plan. So he retreated again into the shell of austerity, living modestly and limiting himself in everything. Once more he slipped from an atmosphere of cleanliness and decency into one of vulgarity and squalor. And while waiting for better times, he even consented to become a legal agent, an occupation as yet without official recognition among us. A legal agent is subject to pressure from all sides. His superiors despise him. Even menial clerks treat him without consideration. He is doomed to fawn on minor employees in outer offices and to suffer their rudeness. But in the circumstances in which he found himself, Chichikov was willing to put up with anything.